Hello, good afternoon. Today we're going to be looking at the next issue of development, that is poverty, right? So we'll be looking at inequality, poverty, and development, the link between the three. So these are the themes I'll be looking at. Measurement: how do we measure poverty? If someone is poor, how do we measure it? And the link between inequality and poverty. But actually in the lecture later on, we begin with inequality and then how inequality leads to poverty. Now, the economic characteristics of poverty groups. I wouldn't go into detail, but basically it deals with issues. How do you measure poverty? How do you account someone to be living in poverty? Is it just income based or any other methods or ways of measuring poverty? And then we'll be looking at relationship between development and equality before we move to relationship between development and equality first before we move to development and poverty. Now, why is inequality a problem? This is a question we need to ask ourselves. Are less people living in poverty now than there were about 10 or 20 years ago? Or let's consider about your timeline in terms of when you were born and now you are an adult. Do you see any changes in terms of, have you witnessed any changes in terms of, do you see more people are poor now than let's say about 10 or 15 years ago? Now, the other question is, why are some regions or countries are rich while others are poor? This is especially if, let's say, why some region, although they are very, very rich in terms of resources, but why are they poor? What is the cause and what are the reasons? And the other question is inequality between poor and rich countries decreasing? If it is decreasing, why? If it is not, who is responsible? How do you decrease inequality within a country and also between poor and rich countries? So we'll be looking at the ASEAN region to look at this later on, and then specifically looking at our own country, basically what is the status between the rich and the poor in Malaysia. Now, the other questions we need to bear in mind is, are global poverty and inequality better seen in class rather than country-specific terms? This is a very important question for you as international relations student, because your perspective on things has to be global in nature. And how does this relate with the perspective that focus on class formation? So we'll touch a bit on this as we look at Malaysia later. So the other question that we need to bear in mind is also, what are the reasons for global poverty and inequality? If they do exist, inequality do exist, what are there any solutions? So who is responsible to bring on, carry out these solutions to make sure that inequality and poverty decrease or reduce throughout the years? Now, let's look at the magnitude of this situation first. In 18th, 19th centuries, you must always remember that sociology of development, when scholars begin to be concerned about development, it was immediately after or as a result of the first industrial revolution in England. You have seen that in earlier parts of the lecture, when 18th, 19th centuries political economists wrote about inequality as the central issue of their times, right? So actually one of the reasons why development becomes a focus, become a concern, is because we see progress moving on, we see industrialization, bringing in economic development or economic progress, economic growth, but at the same time poverty is manifesting itself, and there is inequality, and that has impact on social harmony in society. So that is one of the reasons why poverty or inequality in the context of development has been a central issue, not only 18th, 19th centuries, but also today in the 20th century. Now, Adam Smith, as you remember, Adam Smith, the father of what they call classical capitalism, he said, wherever there is great property, there is great inequality. For one very rich man, there must be at least 500 poor, and the affluence of the few supposes the indigence of the many. So that's what basically Adam Smith, when he talks about the nature of inequality in the context of capitalism, right? Now today, these are some facts that we must bear in mind. Of the world's 7 billion people, 2.8 billion survive on $2 US dollars a day, and 1.2 on $1 a day. That is about 20% of the population. Now, if you look at in the global context, US, Europe, and Japan, these are members of the G7. They are 100 times richer on average than Ethiopia, Haiti, and Nepal. Right. So these are some very, very important facts to consider. The critics argue that rich are getting richer. We have mentioned that, and in fact, when you remember the world president McNamara, he was very concerned why are the rich getting richer, why the poor getting poorer, and not only between countries, within countries you can see the rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer. Now, there's also the other thing is absolute and relative poverty increasing according to critical scholars, meaning that some scholars highlight that despite and in spite the economic progress and the social progress that the world or the societies at large are experiencing, in fact, the number of absolute and relative poverty are increasing. Right? So, mainstream economists, scholars, and politicians, spokesperson for international organizations like IMF and World Bank oftentimes they provide a bit assessment saying that, poverty is decreasing and economic growth is growing and so on and so forth. So they often give very positive or very upbeat assessment, and oftentimes they subsume, they cover up the real situation on the ground. So that is why sometimes scholars can be very skeptical about the numbers they provide. David Dolan and Art Crane 2002, for instance, says at the turn of the century, widely quoted studies suggest the best evidence shows that the current wave of globalization, which started around 1980, has actually promoted economic equality and reduced poverty. That's what they say. Others at the World Bank suggest in 1988-1993 world income inequality is very high and increasing. So you can see there are two pendapat di sini, two ideas here. One is saying there's reduced poverty. Economic equality has gone up, but there are others that suggesting, and actually it's the other way around. So oftentimes, so this creates what they call it, different picture about what's really going on now. But for us, the real question for us is, why is inequality bad? This is because extreme inequality leads to economic inefficiency and stopped, or basically curtailed growth. Extreme inequality undermines social stability and solidarity, and extreme inequality is viewed as unfair. So it has a moral argument about it. Ada norma-norma nilai-nilai yang mengatakan bahawa perbezaan dari segi ekonomi itu adalah sesuatu yang tidak munasabah, right? So, and to a certain degree, it undermines social stability and solidarity. Now, for you, especially as international students, that's why if you look at ASEAN, the formation of ASEAN, although it is set up within the context of concern about security, military security. But if you look at ASEAN, it is basically the core of it is to promote socio-economic development in the region. So basically looking at, say, if promote or prosper your neighbor so that you prosper yourself. So in a sense that social stability and solidarity depends so much on economic development. So that is why ASEAN, if you see, the aim is basically to promote socio-economic development. Right? Now there are income inequality within nations. Sabah, for instance, is 5.5 times poorer compared to the national poverty average of 3.6. So actually, the poorest here in Malaysia, you can find them in apparently located in up north Sabah. So so there are huge income inequality within nations. Yeah. Now, income inequality, highest levels within nations. So, for instance, not only in Malaysia, but also if you look at in the US and you see the riots growing on in the US, and one of the reasons is the income inequality between classes, and some suggest between different groups of people based on skin color and all that thing. So some people suggest that studies suggest that there is a greater inequality in the US now since compared to, let's say, 1920s. The richest 5% of households receive 6 times more income than poorest 20% households. So I hope you're following the news in the US. You look at some of the reaction to the rich people or to those who are or billionaires and stuff like that. So some of this is they're questioning the income inequality, but there are different ways of looking at it, and we'll be looking at how different theories will be looking will argue or will look at the same scenario but come up with different explanation. Yeah. Paul Krugman said that 70% of all income growth in the US in the 1980s went to the richest 1% of all families in the US. So the wealth is richest 1% of households own 42% of stock, 55% of all bonds, 44% of all trusts, so 71% of all non-corporate business. Yeah, so pointed out about in the US. Then also inequality between nations. So inequality is not only within nations but also between nations. Yeah, so Nigeria and India, and then you compare Nigeria and India and other places in Europe, you can see huge differences between nations. Even within ASEAN later on, we'll be looking at that, right? So how is income inequality measured? That is the next part of the lecture. We'll be looking at that shortly, so part 2 of the lecture.